The morning of July 24, 1944, brought Colonel Robert Coffey face to face with a reality that contradicted everything the Army Air Forces had taught him about fighter aviation. His 56th Fighter Group had just received orders to load 500-pound general-purpose bombs onto their P-47 Thunderbolts, aircraft designed for dogfighting at 30,000 feet, not mudslinging at treetop level. The armament officers at Boxted Airfield in England looked at the orders like they'd been asked to mount torpedoes on a bicycle. Fighter doctrine in 1943 was absolute. Fighters existed to shoot down enemy aircraft and escort bombers. Ground attack was the province of dedicated attack aircraft, like the A-20 Havoc or light bombers. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, all 7 tons of it, represented the Army Air Force's commitment to high-altitude air superiority. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine generated 2,000 horsepower, specifically to push pilots above 35,000 feet, where they could intercept German bombers. Strapping bombs to fighters seemed like heresy or desperation. The desperation was real. General Omar Bradley's First Army had been grinding through Normandy's hedgerows for 6 weeks, with casualties approaching 40,000 men. German Panzer divisions were bleeding the advance white, appearing suddenly from concealed positions, destroying American armor, then vanishing before artillery could respond. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force's tactical groups were flying continuous missions, but they couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. The 8th Air Force's heavy fighters, the P-47 groups originally assigned to bomber escort, represented an untapped resource. Hundreds of aircraft with nothing to shoot at, now that German fighters were avoiding daylight combat. Coffey's maintenance crews spent July 23 fabricating makeshift bomb shackles from salvaged British components. The P-47's belly hardpoints could theoretically carry external stores, but Republic Aviation had never certified the aircraft for bomb loads exceeding 2 50-pound weapons. 500 pounds of high explosive created forces during release that might rip mounting brackets clean off the airframe. Nobody had tested it. Nobody had time to test it. The ground war wasn't waiting for engineering studies. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The physics of dropping bombs from a fighter traveling 400 miles per hour at low altitude involved calculations that most pilots had never studied. Dive bombers like the Stuka or Dauntless approached targets in controlled 70-degree dives, releasing from 3,000 feet with air brakes deployed to maintain stable speeds. Fighter pilots flew straight and level, or violently maneuvered, nothing in between. The P-47's sheer momentum meant that bombs released below 1,000 feet would barely separate from the aircraft before impacting, potentially catching the releasing fighter in its own blast radius. The 8th Air Force hastily organized training sessions at British ranges during the 3rd week of July. Pilots practiced shallow dive attacks against hulks positioned in fields, learning release angles through trial and error. Captain Robert Johnson, a 20-kill ace with the 56th Fighter Group, later described his first bombing run as feeling like throwing an anvil while riding a motorcycle. The P-47 shuddered when the bomb separated, the sudden loss of 500 pounds creating an abrupt nose-up pitch that required immediate stick input to prevent stalling. Accuracy proved abysmal. Experienced fighter pilots accustomed to deflection shooting and dogfighting geometry couldn't consistently place bombs within 50 yards of stationary targets. The Army Air Forces accepted this. They weren't asking for precision. They wanted saturation, multiple P-47 seconds dumping ordnance across suspected German positions, trading accuracy for overwhelming explosive tonnage. A single fighter group could deliver 30 tons of bombs in one mission, equivalent to a medium bomber squadron's payload, and do it faster with better survivability against German flak. German armoured doctrine in Normandy relied on concealment and mobility. Panzer divisions operated in small Kampfgruppen, battle groups mixing tanks, infantry, and self-propelled guns that moved through bocage terrain using centuries-old farm trails invisible from the air. These groups would concentrate rapidly when American forces advanced, strike hard, then disperse before Allied artillery could coordinate counter-battery fire. The system worked because German commanders understood that American air power, while overwhelming in numbers, required pre-planned targeting. Fighters couldn't attack what they couldn't find, and bombers needed coordinates radioed hours in advance. Operation Cobra changed those assumptions. Bradley's plan for breaking out of Normandy required concentrating 7 infantry and 3 armoured divisions on a 5-mile front west of Saint-Lô. The attack would begin after a massive aerial bombardment delivered by every available aircraft in the theatre. Heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force would saturate German positions with 1,000-pounders. Medium bombers would follow with fragmentation clusters. Then fighters, hundreds of fighters carrying whatever ordnance they could lift, would roam freely across the breakthrough zone, destroying any German unit attempting to reinforce the collapsing front. Coffey's 56th Fighter Group received mission orders on the evening of July 24. 16 P-47 seconds would take off at 0900 hours the next morning, each carrying one 500-pound ANM-64 general-purpose bomb and 850 caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. Their assigned patrol sector covered 10 square miles of countryside south of the Périlleuse Saint-Lô road, the boundary where American forces expected German armoured reserves to appear once the bombardment lifted. The orders were explicit: destroy every vehicle, every tank, every concentration of troops attempting to move north toward the American breakthrough. The ANM-64 bomb itself represented decades of American explosive engineering, though calling it sophisticated would be generous. It was a thin-walled steel cylinder filled with 195 pounds of TNT, amatol, or tritonal, depending on which ordnance depot filled it. 2 fuses, one in the nose and one in the tail, ensured detonation on impact. The weapon dated to 1941 designs and had changed little since. What made it effective against armor wasn't penetration. The blast couldn't crack a Panther's hull, but overpressure and fragmentation. A 500-pounder detonating within 20 feet of a tank would strip away external equipment, antennas, periscopes, vision blocks, and often kill or stun the crew through concussive force transmitted through the armor itself. The morning of July 25th began with fog that delayed the entire Cobra operation by hours. Heavy bombers, scheduled for 0930 attacks, didn't begin their runs until 1300 hours. The delay cascaded through every element of the plan, and by the time Coffey's group launched at 1400 hours, the battlefield had devolved into chaos. American infantry had advanced into areas still being bombed by late-arriving heavies. German positions that should have been obliterated were returning fire. Radio communications filled with frantic calls for air support, often with contradictory coordinates. Coffey led his 16 P-47 seconds south at 8,000 feet, following the Vire River until reaching their assigned patrol zone. The landscape below looked apocalyptic. Smoke from thousands of bomb craters merged into a grey-brown haze that obscured roads and landmarks. Scattered fires burned in tree lines where incendiaries had ignited dry summer vegetation. Coffey's wingman, Lieutenant Francis Gerard, later recalled that finding specific targets in that obscured hellscape seemed impossible until they spotted movement. The German column appeared 3 miles south of Hébécrevon, moving north on a secondary road that American intelligence had considered impassable after the morning bombardment. Coffey counted at least 30 vehicles through breaks in the smoke, a mixed formation including tracked half-tracks, wheeled trucks, and what appeared to be self-propelled guns. The column moved slowly, perhaps 10 miles per hour, picking through cratered sections of road. They weren't attempting concealment. Speed was their priority, getting north to stop American forces before the breakthrough became irreversible. Coffey's radio call was economical. 61st Squadron, we have movers, follow me down. He rolled inverted and pulled into a 40-degree dive, centering the lead vehicle in his gun sight. The P-47 accelerated rapidly in the dive, airspeed climbing past 350 knots. At 1,500 feet, Coffey pressed the bomb release on his control stick. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder, and felt the characteristic thump as the shackles opened. The 500-pound bomb separated cleanly, dropping nose first in a ballistic arc. Coffey pulled hard on the stick, loading the airframe with 5 Gs as he climbed away from the target. Behind him, the bomb impacted directly in front of the lead half-track, detonating in an orange-black fireball that engulfed 3 vehicles simultaneously. The half-track disintegrated, its thin armor no protection against the blast wave. Fragments from the bomb casing scythed through the column, shredding canvas-covered trucks and puncturing fuel tanks. Gerard followed seconds later, releasing his bomb from 1,200 feet. His weapon landed short, detonating in the road 50 feet ahead of the column, but the effect was devastating. The cratered road became impassable, and the entire column halted as drivers tried to reverse or maneuver around the destruction. That immobility sealed their fate. The remaining 14 P-47 seconds didn't drop bombs. They strafed. Coffey's squadron had trained for ground attack using the same dive and break tactics they employed against aircraft, but compressed into a much smaller airspace. Each pilot would dive to within 800 feet, fire a 2-second burst of 50 caliber fire approximately 1,000 rounds from all 8 guns, then brake hard left or right to avoid colliding with the ground or other aircraft. The 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition represented one of the war's most effective anti-vehicle weapons. Each round massed 750 grains and exited the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate 30 millimeters of armor plate at 500 yards. The incendiary component, a small charge in the projectile's base, ignited on impact, creating secondary fires in fuel systems and ammunition storage. Lieutenant Gerard's after-action report described his strafing run in clinical detail. He targeted a tracked vehicle near the column's center, possibly a Stooge 3 assault gun based on its low profile. His burst walked from the road up across the vehicle's engine deck. Armor-piercing rounds punched through the thin top armor, and within seconds, orange flames erupted from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out immediately, 3 men dropping from hatches and running toward a nearby tree line. Gerard didn't pursue them. He was already climbing, turning to re-enter the pattern for another pass. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. 16 P-47 seconds made an average of 3 passes each, expending approximately 190,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 16 500-pound bombs. When Coffey finally called 61st Squadron, Reform, the road below was a continuous line of burning vehicles. His gun camera footage, reviewed that evening at Boxted, showed at least 23 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, with several secondary explosions suggesting ammunition trucks had detonated. The German unit under attack was later identified as elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, attempting to reinforce defensive positions north of Saint-Lô. Their after-action reports, captured after the war, described the attack as lasting nearly 30 minutes, which suggests multiple P-47 groups struck the same column in sequence. German survivors reported that the continuous strafing made dismounting from vehicles suicidal, while remaining inside was equally fatal. Those who survived did so by abandoning their equipment and fleeing into adjacent forests. But July 25th was only the beginning. The success of Operation Cobra created a 50-mile-wide breach in German lines within 72 hours. Third Army poured through, and suddenly German armored divisions were attempting to move in daylight, trying to contain a breakthrough that was expanding faster than their supply lines could sustain. Every road south of the breakthrough became a killing ground for roaming P-47 seconds. The engagement that would define the P-47's ground attack reputation happened on July 29th, 4 days after Coffey's initial strike. The target was the German 7th Army's attempt to establish a defensive line along the Seine River. To reach their positions, multiple Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions had to funnel through a handful of bridges and road junctions east of Coutances. American intelligence identified the movement on the morning of July 29th and allocated every available fighter group to interdiction missions. The 8th Air Force committed 21 P-47 groups, over 600 aircraft, to what became known as the Coutances Gap attacks. Groups launched in waves throughout the afternoon, each flight assigned specific road segments between Coutances and Gavray. The scale was unprecedented. a continuous stream of fighters covering 40 square miles of terrain, attacking anything that moved. Major Francis Gabreski, leading the 61st Fighter Squadron that afternoon, spotted a German column north of Lengron at 1600 hours. What made this engagement different from Coffey's earlier attack was the target composition. This wasn't a mixed convoy of support vehicles. Gabreski counted 43 armoured vehicles through his canopy, a full Panzer battalion moving in close formation along a narrow road bordered by stone walls. The vehicles included Panzer IVs, Panthers, and at least 2 Tiger Is, identified by their massive hulls and 88mm guns. Attacking heavy tanks with 500-pound bombs and 50-caliber guns seemed optimistic at best. The Tiger I's frontal armour measured 100mm thick, essentially immune to anything short of a direct bomb hit or dedicated anti-tank weapons. But Gabreski understood something about armour vulnerability that would be repeatedly validated throughout the Normandy campaign. Tanks weren't destroyed exclusively through penetration. Mobility kills, mechanical failures, crew abandonment, all achieved the same operational result. Gabreski's attack plan was methodical. His 16 P-47 seconds would divide into 4 flights. The first flight would drop their bombs across the road ahead of the column, blocking forward movement. The second flight would bomb the rear, trapping the column. The remaining flights would strafe systematically from nose to tail, targeting not the tanks themselves but their supporting vehicles, the half-tracks carrying infantry, the trucks hauling fuel and ammunition, the recovery vehicles, needed to repair battle damage. The attack commenced at 16:15 hours. Gabreski's first flight dove through scattered clouds, releasing their bombs from 2,000 feet. The explosions created a barrier of craters and debris that immediately halted the column's lead elements. Second flight followed within 30 seconds, bombing the road behind the last vehicles. The Panzer battalion was now stationary on a road barely wide enough for a single vehicle, with stone walls preventing lateral movement. The strafing runs began. P-47 seconds dove in continuous succession, each pilot selecting individual vehicles as targets. Armour-piercing incendiary rounds sparked off turret faces and hull plates when they hit Panthers and Tigers directly, but caused catastrophic damage to softer targets. Half-tracks exploded as fuel tanks ruptured. Trucks disintegrated under the hammering 50-caliber impacts. German infantry dismounted and scattered, seeking cover in adjacent fields, which meant the tanks lost their protective screen against close-range attacks. Lieutenant Quince Brown, flying as Gabreski's wingman, documented targeting a Panther tank on his third pass. His gun camera footage shows his tracers impacting the tank's engine deck and rear hull. The armour didn't penetrate, but the incendiary rounds ignited external fuel canisters mounted on the tank's rear. Within seconds, flames engulfed the engine compartment. The crew attempted to extinguish the fire but abandoned the vehicle after approximately 2 minutes. The Panther itself suffered no catastrophic damage, but it was operationally destroyed, immobilized, and burning on a road with no recovery assets available. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement lasted 43 minutes, limited only by ammunition exhaustion. Gabreski's group expended their ordnance and reformed, but other P-47 groups arrived immediately after. The 56th Fighter Group struck at 1700 hours. The 4th Fighter Group followed at 1730. German vehicles that survived the initial attacks were targeted repeatedly throughout the evening until darkness finally provided concealment. Post-mission reconnaissance photos taken on July 30th showed the Lengron road obliterated. Analysts counted 68 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, including 17 medium and heavy tanks. The German Panzer Lehr division, which had committed elements to the column, reported losing 70% of its operational armour during the Coutances Gap fighting. Division Commander Fritz Bayerlein later wrote that his unit ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after July 29th, reduced to scattered infantry groups lacking heavy weapons. The psychological impact on German tank crews rivaled the material losses. Panzer divisions had operated with relative impunity during the Blitzkrieg years, when Luftwaffe air superiority protected ground forces from aerial attack. By late July 1944, that protection had evaporated. German fighters rarely appeared over Normandy, leaving armour exposed to continuous Allied air attack. Captured documents from the 2nd Panzer Division included orders forbidding daylight movement except under emergency conditions. Commanders who violated this directive faced court-martial. Tank crews developed what American intelligence officers termed fighter fear, a reluctance to operate vehicles even when tactically necessary. Multiple after-action reports from German units described crews abandoning functional tanks after spotting Allied aircraft, even when those aircraft hadn't yet attacked. The mere sound of radial engines overhead triggered panic. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational response to asymmetric warfare. A tank crew buttoned up inside armour couldn't see attacking fighters until bombs or bullets arrived. They were helpless passengers waiting for death delivered from an angle their weapons couldn't engage. The P-47's effectiveness stemmed partly from characteristics Republic aviation never intended for ground attack. The massive radial engine mounted in the nose provided exceptional protection against ground fire. German 20mm and 37mm flak guns that could shred liquid-cooled fighters like the P-51 Mustang would hit the P-47's cowling and damage cylinders without stopping the aircraft. Pilots routinely returned to base with multiple flak holes, sections of cowling missing, and cylinders destroyed. Yet the R-2800 engine continued running on its remaining good cylinders. The aircraft's sheer mass also contributed to survivability. A P-47 fully loaded weighed 14,000 pounds, almost double a Mustang's weight. This momentum meant the Thunderbolt could absorb battle damage that would send lighter fighters spinning out of control. Hydraulic failures, control surface damage, even partial wing destruction, the P-47 absorbed punishment and kept flying. Pilots learned to trust the aircraft's durability, which encouraged aggressive low-altitude attacks that would be suicidal in more fragile fighters. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, documented the evolution in pilot tactics in his mission reports from August 1944. Early bombing missions followed rigid attack patterns, all aircraft diving from the same angle, releasing at similar altitudes, creating predictable approaches that German flak gunners exploited. By mid-August, pilots had developed individualized techniques based on target type and defensive fire intensity. Against columns with minimal flak protection, pilots would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing gunners from concentrating fire. Heavily defended positions received skip bombing attacks, where pilots released bombs from extremely low altitude, allowing the weapons to skip across the ground like stones on water before impacting targets. This technique was extraordinarily dangerous, placing aircraft within small arms range, but created angles of attack that flak guns couldn't depress low enough to engage. The mechanics of skip bombing defied official doctrine. Army Air Force's training manuals specified minimum release altitudes of 800 feet for 500-pound bombs to ensure safe separation from blast effects. Skip bombing required releases below 100 feet, sometimes as low as 50 feet, placing the aircraft well within the bomb's lethal fragmentation radius of 200 feet. Pilots survived through speed and timing. The P-47, traveling at 400 miles per hour, would cover 600 feet per second, meaning a bomb released at 50 feet would impact roughly 1 second after release, when the fighter was already 600 feet away. Theoretically safe. In practice, fragments frequently damaged trailing aircraft, and several P-47 seconds were lost to their own bomb blasts during the Normandy campaign. The effectiveness of these tactics became quantifiable in August when 9th Air Force began systematic battle damage assessment. Fighter groups submitted detailed reports including gun camera footage, pilot observations, and post-strike reconnaissance photos. Analysts correlated these reports with German unit records captured later, creating a statistical picture of fighter-bomber effectiveness that surprised even advocates of tactical air power. Between July 25th and August 20th, 1944, P-47 groups from the 8th and 9th Air Forces flew approximately 42,000 sorties over Normandy and Brittany. They claimed destruction of 1,297 armoured vehicles, 4,613 trucks and staff cars, 527 artillery pieces, and 342 locomotives. German records suggested these claims were inflated, which was typical in air combat accounting, but even conservative estimates indicated fighter bombers destroyed or damaged 30 to 40% of German armored vehicles attempting to reach defensive positions during the breakout phase. The strategic implications went beyond simple kill ratios. German armored divisions maneuvered based on speed and concentration. Panzer doctrine required rapidly assembling scattered units at decisive points, overwhelming enemy defenses through shock and firepower, then dispersing before counterattacks developed. This doctrine required daylight movement and road networks. Allied fighter bombers made both impossible. German armor could move only at night, on secondary roads or across country, which reduced movement rates from 30 miles per day to perhaps 5 or 10 miles. By the time armored reserves reached threatened sectors, American forces had already advanced beyond those positions. The Falaise Pocket, where Allied forces encircled and destroyed the German 7th Army in mid-August, exemplified this dynamic. German commanders attempted to extract surviving units through a narrow corridor between Falaise and Argentan. Every road through that corridor became a target for Allied fighters. The weather on August 17th was perfect for air operations, clear skies, and unlimited visibility. The 8th Air Force launched every available P-47 over 800 aircraft against German forces attempting to escape the pocket. Captain Witold Lanowski of the 61st Fighter Squadron flew 3 missions that day, landing only to rearm and refuel before launching again. His after-action report described targets so numerous that pilots couldn't prioritize. Every road held abandoned vehicles. Every tree line concealed troops attempting to evade detection. Lanowski's first mission targeted a column northeast of Argentan, destroying 11 trucks before his ammunition ran out. His second mission, flown that afternoon, struck German forces attempting to ford the Dives River, killing infantry in open fields who had no cover and no anti-aircraft protection. His third mission, launched at 1800 hours, was different. Lanowski's 4-ship flight patrolled between Trun and Chambois, the narrowest section of the escape corridor, searching for vehicle concentrations. What they found was a slaughter already in progress. Canadian and Polish ground forces had closed the gap, trapping thousands of German soldiers in a pocket measuring barely 3 miles across. Artillery fire from 3 sides churned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and debris. Allied fighters circled overhead like predators, diving whenever movement appeared below. Lanowski didn't drop bombs on that final mission. He strafed, expending his remaining ammunition against vehicles that were often already immobilized or burning. His report included an observation that captured the essential brutality of the Falaise fighting. We weren't attacking an army anymore, we were finishing it. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers escaped the Falaise Pocket. 10,000 died, and another 50,000 were captured. They left behind virtually all their heavy equipment. Allied intelligence estimated that German forces abandoned or lost 350 tanks, 950 field guns, and over 7,000 vehicles inside the pocket. Fighter bombers contributed to perhaps 20% of that destruction, with artillery and direct ground combat accounting for the majority. But the material losses mattered less than the temporal advantage fighters provided. German units that might have escaped if given 12 hours to withdraw were trapped because air attacks delayed their movement by those critical hours. Columns that needed 6 hours to travel 20 miles took 18 hours instead, arriving only after Allied ground forces had blocked their routes. This temporal dimension of air power, the ability to slow enemy maneuver below operationally effective speeds, became the P-47's most significant contribution to the Normandy campaign. The aircraft's role evolved beyond simple destruction. P-47 pilots became aerial reconnaissance assets, radioing locations of German concentrations to ground commanders minutes after spotting them. They became artillery spotters, marking targets with smoke rockets for artillery batteries. They became psychological weapons, their presence overhead forcing German troops to remain concealed even when tactical situations required movement. The versatility that made the P-47 initially seem unsuitable for ground attack, too heavy, too fast, designed for high altitude, became advantages in the chaotic multi-role environment of tactical air support. Yet the price of this effectiveness was measured in pilots and aircraft. The 8th Air Force lost 216 P-47 seconds to all causes during July and August 1944, including 63 aircraft lost to ground fire during low-altitude missions. The 9th Air Force, flying continuous tactical missions since D-Day, lost 498 P-47 seconds during the same period. Many of these losses came from flak, the ubiquitous German anti-aircraft guns that filled the air around any military concentration with explosive shells. German flak doctrine in Normandy emphasized mobility and concealment. Unlike static flak batteries defending industrial targets, field flak units traveled with combat formations, setting up rapidly when columns halted, then displacing before Allied aircraft could target them. The most effective German flak weapon was the Flakvierling 38, a quad-mounted 20mm autocannon that fired 1,800 rounds per minute. A single Flakvierling couldn't reliably shoot down an attacking fighter, but 6 or 8 guns firing simultaneously created a curtain of explosive projectiles that any aircraft had to penetrate. Pilots described flying through flak as feeling like driving through a hailstorm made of fire. The visual experience was almost surreal, small black puffs appearing in clusters, often beautiful in a terrible way, until proximity made the danger visceral. Exploding shells created pressure waves that shook aircraft violently. Fragments punched through aluminum skin with sounds pilots compared to hammers hitting sheet metal. Every strafing run meant flying through this gauntlet, and statistical probability dictated that enough runs would eventually produce a hit in something critical. Second Lieutenant Robert Werner of the 56th Fighter Group was hit by flak during a mission on August 3rd while strafing a truck column near Mortain. A 20mm shell detonated against his left wing root, destroying the leading edge and severing control cables. The P-47 immediately rolled inverted and entered a spin. Werner fought the controls, using rudder alone to arrest the spin, while the aircraft descended through 4,000 feet. He recovered below 800 feet, too low for bailout, and somehow managed to nurse the damaged fighter back to emergency landing strips at Cherbourg. The P-47's right wing had absorbed 17 separate flak fragments, any one of which might have downed a lighter fighter. Stories like Werner's reinforced pilot confidence in the aircraft, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental arithmetic of attrition warfare. Every mission risked aircraft and pilots. The more missions flown, the higher the probability of loss. By September 1944, some 8th Air Force squadrons had completely turned over their pilot rosters since D-Day, with every pilot from June either killed, captured, or rotated home. The survivors were often veterans of 70 or 80 missions, far exceeding the standard tour length, kept in combat because experienced ground attack pilots had become too valuable to withdraw. The transformation of the P-47 from high-altitude escort fighter to ground attack aircraft represented one of the war's most successful improvisations. Nobody planned it during the aircraft's design phase. Republic Aviation was building an interceptor, not a fighter bomber. The Army Air Forces wanted a high-altitude escort, not a tactical support platform. Yet combat requirements overrode original intentions, and the P-47's fundamental characteristics – heavy construction, powerful engine, massive ammunition capacity – proved ideally suited for a role its designers never imagined. The fighter bomber concept wasn't new. The Luftwaffe had employed Stukas and May 109 seconds in ground attack roles since 1939. The Royal Air Force's Typhoon had been decimating German armor with rockets since 1943. What made the P-47 significant was scale. American industry produced 15,683 P-47 seconds, far exceeding production of any other Allied fighter type. This mass availability meant that by mid-1944, the Allies could afford to allocate hundreds of fighters simultaneously to ground attack missions creating a density of coverage that made German daylight movement impossible across entire front sectors. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 would test whether German forces could exploit weather conditions that grounded Allied fighters and simultaneously demonstrate how dependent the Wehrmacht had become on avoiding American air power. Hitler's plan for the winter offensive assumed that heavy cloud cover and winter storms would neutralize Allied air superiority for at least 10 days, providing German armored spearheads time to reach the Meuse River bridges before fighters could intervene. The offensive launched on December 16th, under perfect conditions for the attackers. Thick fog blanketed the Ardennes forests, reducing visibility to under 200 yards. Cloud ceilings sat at 300 feet, far below minimums for any air operations. For the first 4 days, Allied fighters remained grounded while German Panzer divisions advanced 60 miles, creating a bulge in American lines that threatened to split Bradley's 12th Army Group. Weather forecasts predicted the overcast would persist through Christmas. German commanders planned their logistics and reinforcement schedules accordingly. But weather is stochastic, and forecasts fail. On December 23rd, a high-pressure system swept across Western Europe, bringing clear skies and unlimited visibility. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, brutal for ground troops but perfect for aviation. Every Allied airfield from England to France launched maximum effort missions. The 8th Air Force committed over 2,000 heavy bombers to tactical support, an unprecedented diversion from strategic bombing. They were supported by 28 P-47 groups, approximately 700 fighters, assigned to armed reconnaissance across the entire Ardennes salient. The mission was simple: find German columns, destroy them. No pre-planned targets, no specific coordinates. Pilots would patrol assigned sectors and attack anything moving on roads below. Colonel David Schilling, leading the 56th Fighter Group, departed Boxted at 0900 hours on December 23rd with 64 P-47 seconds, each carrying 2 500-pound bombs and full ammunition loads. His assigned sector covered the road network between Bastogne and Houffalize, the main supply route for German forces attempting to encircle the trapped American garrison at Bastogne. Intelligence suggested heavy German traffic on these roads, armor and supply columns moving during daylight for the first time since the offensive began. What Schilling found exceeded intelligence estimates. The roads below held virtually continuous vehicle columns, stretching for miles in both directions. German logistics planners, assuming continued bad weather, had concentrated supply movements during daylight to maximize throughput. Fuel trucks, ammunition transporters, tank recovery vehicles, all the vulnerable rear echelon elements that armies need but cannot defend against air attack, they were exposed and moving in the open. Schilling's radio call went to all 4 squadrons. Targets everywhere, pairs disperse and attack individually. The formation dissolved as P-47 seconds broke off in 2 ship elements, each pair selecting different sections of road. The resulting engagement wasn't a coordinated strike but rather 64 independent attacks happening simultaneously across 30 square miles of terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, now leading the 61st Fighter Squadron after his promotion, targeted a column northwest of Houffalize that included at least 6 King Tiger tanks, the Wehrmacht's newest and heaviest armor. The King Tiger mounted an 88mm gun and featured frontal armor exceeding 180mm thick, essentially invulnerable to any weapon short of battleship artillery. Gabreski wasn't planning to penetrate that armor. He aimed for the support vehicles. His first pass targeted fuel trucks traveling with the column. The 500-pound bomb impacted directly beside a tanker trailer, detonating the vehicle's cargo in a fireball that consumed 3 adjacent trucks. Gabreski's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, released his bomb into the road ahead of the King Tigers, blocking their advance. The massive tanks halted, unable to push through the cratered road, and their supporting infantry dismounted to clear debris. That immobility provided opportunity for follow-up attacks. Other P-47 seconds arrived within minutes, strafing the stalled column. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds couldn't penetrate King Tiger hulls, but they destroyed every soft target around them. Half-tracks carrying infantry exploded. Supply trucks disintegrated. The tanks themselves remained functional, but without fuel, without infantry protection, without ammunition resupply. They became expensive stationary pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. Across the Ardennes that day, similar scenes repeated hundreds of times. The 9th Air Force flew over 1,100 fighter-bomber sorties. The RAF contributed another 300 Typhoon missions. German units that had advanced confidently during the weather cover now found themselves trapped on roads, unable to advance or retreat while Allied fighters circled overhead. The weather remained clear for 3 consecutive days, December 23rd through 25th, and Allied aircraft flew over 6,000 sorties during that 72-hour period. German after-action reports from the Ardennes offensive identified December 23rd as the decisive turning point, more significant than Patton's Third Army relief of Bastogne or Allied counterattacks. The reports noted that ammunition expenditure rates during the first week of the offensive exceeded German logistics capacity even under ideal conditions. Air interdiction during the weather break didn't just delay resupply, it made resupply impossible. Columns attempting to reach forward units were destroyed en route. Fuel depots identified from aerial reconnaissance were bombed before their contents could be distributed. German armoured spearheads exhausted their fuel and ammunition by December 26th, and many units abandoned their vehicles where they stood, rather than waiting for resupply that would never arrive. 5th Panzer Army Commander Hasso von Manteuffel later testified during post-war interrogations that his offensive capability ended on December 24th, not from American ground resistance but from inability to sustain logistics under air attack. His units had advanced approximately 60% of the distance to the Meuse River. They held dominant tactical positions, but they were immobilized, and immobile armor serves no offensive purpose. The statistical accounting of the Ardennes air campaign revealed numbers that seemed almost implausible. Allied fighter bombers claimed destruction of 823 tanks and self-propelled guns, 4,571 trucks and cars, 504 half-tracks, and 614 artillery pieces during December 1944. German loss records suggested the actual figures were approximately 60% of claimed totals, which still represented catastrophic material attrition. The Wehrmacht entered the Ardennes with approximately 2,000 armoured vehicles. They extracted fewer than 800 operational vehicles when the offensive collapsed in January. The P-47's effectiveness in the Ardennes validated a transformation that had begun with improvised bomb racks back in July. Fighter aviation had fundamentally changed from air-to-air combat to a multi-role capability where ground attack constituted the primary mission. By early 1945, P-47 groups flew 5 ground attack sorties for every air-to-air combat mission. Pilots trained extensively on bombing techniques, dive angles, target identification, and artillery cooperation, while aerial gunnery practice became secondary. The fighter, as an aircraft category, was evolving into the fighter-bomber, a transformation the P-47 pioneered and subsequent designs would standardize. Republic Aviation responded to this evolution by developing the P-47 Newton's variant specifically for long-range ground attack. The N model featured increased fuel capacity, strengthened wing hardpoints capable of carrying 3,000 pounds of external ordnance, and reinforced landing gear for operations from rough forward airstrips. The first P-47Ns reached Pacific Theatre units in May 1945, where they proved devastatingly effective against Japanese infrastructure and shipping during the final months of the war. But the Pacific employment revealed something that European combat had obscured. The P-47's bombing accuracy remained marginal. In the Pacific, where many targets were pinpoint installations, small bridges, radar stations, coastal defense guns, the fighter-bomber's inability to reliably hit specific structures limited its effectiveness. Pilots could saturate areas and destroy concentrations, but precision targeting required dedicated attack aircraft like the A-26 Invader or carrier-based dive bombers. This limitation spawned development of dedicated attack aircraft and precision-guided munitions in subsequent years. The fighter-bomber concept proved its worth for disrupting mobile forces and area targets, but the Air Force recognized it couldn't replace specialized attack platforms. The post-war split between air superiority fighters and attack aircraft reflected lessons learned during the P-47's improvised ground attack employment. Yet, the immediate legacy was undeniable. German commanders who survived the war consistently identified Allied fighter bombers as the weapon system they feared most. Not strategic bombers destroying cities, not artillery barrages, not even massed tank formations. It was the constant presence of fighters overhead, the certainty that daylight movement meant attack, the helplessness of watching aircraft circle beyond the range of ground weapons while selecting targets methodically. This psychological dimension, the transformation of daylight itself into an enemy weapon, may have been the P-47's most significant contribution to Allied victory. The physics behind the P-47's effectiveness were prosaic. A 500-pound bomb delivered perhaps 200 pounds of explosive force against targets that often required thousands of pounds to destroy completely. 50-caliber machine guns, while devastating against soft targets, couldn't reliably penetrate heavy armor. The P-47 wasn't defeating German armor through superior weapon technology. It was defeating armor through operational tempo and attrition. Every vehicle destroyed removed capability from German formations. Every hour German units spent concealed from air attack was an hour they weren't maneuvering. Every kilometer German convoys traveled at night, slowly and blind, was distance American forces covered rapidly during daylight. The cumulative effect of hundreds of mediocre attacks produced operational paralysis more effective than a few precision strikes against critical nodes. This understanding influenced post-war military aviation doctrine globally. The Soviet Union, observing Allied fighter-bomber effectiveness, developed the Sturmovik ground attack branch as a separate aviation arm. The United States formalized close air support procedures and created dedicated Air Force units for tactical support. Even nations without significant air forces recognized that modern ground operations required either air superiority or effective concealment from aerial observation. The men who flew these missions rarely contemplated their broader historical significance. They were executing assigned tasks, attacking targets, returning to base, doing it again the next day. Lieutenant Colonel Gabreski, who completed 28 ground attack missions during the Ardennes fighting, later described the experience as less psychologically stressful than air-to-air combat. Enemy fighters could shoot back at you personally. Ground targets shot at you impersonally, flak filling the sky without specific aim. It was statistically dangerous but felt less threatening. That perception was objectively incorrect. Ground fire accounted for 73% of P-47 combat losses during 1944 and 45. But the psychological comfort of firing on targets that couldn't pursue you, that couldn't maneuver to defeat your attack, created a sense of control that dogfighting never provided. Pilots developed confidence in ground attack that translated into aggressive tactics and acceptance of risks that would be unthinkable in air combat. This aggressive posture sometimes manifested in troubling ways. Gun camera footage from several P-47 missions shows pilots strafing civilian vehicles, attacking targets that were clearly non-military. Some of these attacks were mistakes, target identification failures in the confusion of combat. Others were deliberate, pilots attacking anything moving on roads regardless of military significance. The historical record includes documented instances of P-47 seconds strafing refugee columns, farm equipment, and civilian trains. The Army Air Forces investigated several such incidents during 1945, particularly after Allied forces overran areas where civilians reported fighter attacks. The investigations generally concluded that pilots had mistaken civilian targets for military ones, or had attacked legitimate military targets where civilians were present. Few pilots faced disciplinary action. The operational reality was that accurate target identification from 400 miles per hour at 1,000 feet altitude was effectively impossible. Pilots made split-second judgments based on limited information, and those judgments were sometimes catastrophically wrong. This moral complexity rarely appears in historical accounts that celebrate the P-47's combat effectiveness. The same weapons that destroyed German armor columns also killed uncounted civilians. The same tactics that paralyzed German logistics also made roads dangerous for anyone, military or civilian, attempting to travel. Modern military terminology would classify many of these civilian casualties as collateral damage, an antiseptic phrase that obscures individual deaths behind statistical abstractions. The historical accounting must acknowledge both dimensions. The P-47's ground attack campaign contributed substantially to Allied victory in Europe. It also created conditions where violence became indiscriminate, where the tools of military effectiveness killed without precise discrimination between combatant and civilian. This duality characterizes strategic bombing more famously, but tactical fighter-bomber operations produced similar moral questions on a more intimate scale. The transition from air superiority to ground attack doctrine also affected pilot training pipelines and replacement quality. Early P-47 pilots were trained extensively in aerial gunnery, formation flying, and air combat tactics. By mid-1944, training emphasized bombing runs, target recognition, and navigation at low altitude. New pilots arriving in Europe had often received minimal air-to-air combat training because they would rarely engage enemy aircraft. This shift reduced training time and allowed higher pilot production rates, but it created forces optimized for a single mission type. When German jet aircraft began appearing in significant numbers during early 1945, American fighter groups struggled to counter them effectively. The Me-262 jet fighter could outrun P-47 seconds easily, and inexperienced pilots trained primarily for ground attack lacked the air combat skills to engage jets effectively. The strategic impact was minimal. German jets appeared too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. But the tactical challenges highlighted risks in over-specialization. The final months of the war in Europe saw P-47 groups shift increasingly toward armed reconnaissance and battlefield interdiction, rather than pre-planned strikes. Pilots would launch with basic sector assignments and patrol freely, attacking targets of opportunity. This employment method maximized flexibility, but required exceptional pilot judgment. Each pilot became a tactical decision-maker, determining which targets warranted attack, which were too heavily defended, which might be civilian. These decisions occurred under combat stress, with limited time and incomplete information. The historical record contains numerous examples of correct decisions that saved pilots' lives and destroyed valuable targets. It also contains examples of incorrect decisions that wasted ordnance on worthless targets or killed civilians who posed no military threat. The aggregate success of the fighter-bomber campaign shouldn't obscure the individual failures embedded within it. By April 1945, German resistance in Western Europe had effectively collapsed. Luftwaffe aircraft rarely appeared. Ground forces surrendered in large formations rather than sustaining futile defense. P-47 groups continued flying missions, but the targets became increasingly sparse. Some units flew entire missions without firing a shot, finding only abandoned vehicles and empty roads. The war was ending, and the fighter-bombers' most intense combat employment was concluding with it. The final statistics compiled after Germany's surrender documented the scope of P-47 operations. From D-Day through May 8, 1945, P-47 groups flew approximately 245,000 combat sorties in the European theatre. They claimed destruction of 11,500 armoured vehicles, 86,000 soft-skinned vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 artillery pieces. These claims almost certainly exceeded actual kills by significant margins, but even conservative estimates suggested P-47 seconds destroyed or damaged 30,000 to 40,000 German vehicles, roughly equivalent to the Wehrmacht's entire motor transport inventory on the Western Front. The human cost of achieving those statistics was measured in empty beds at squadron barracks. The 8th and 9th Air Forces lost approximately 3,100 P-47 seconds in combat during the war's final 11 months. Each aircraft represented a pilot killed, captured, or occasionally rescued. Fighter pilot casualty rates were lower than bomber crews faced, But ground attack flying was more dangerous than escort missions had been. Some squadrons lost 50% of their assigned pilots between June 1944 and May 1945. Individual pilot experiences varied enormously. Some men flew 60 or 80 missions without sustaining significant battle damage. Others were shot down on their third or fifth mission. The randomness of flak and ground fire meant that skill and caution provided only marginal protection. Every mission included variables beyond pilot control: the location of hidden flak batteries, the trajectory of individual shell fragments, mechanical failures that might occur at critical moments. This randomness created a fatalistic culture among some ground attack pilots. If survival was partially determined by chance, then excessive caution served little purpose. Better to attack aggressively, complete missions quickly, and return to base before statistical probability caught up. Other pilots adopted the opposite philosophy, carefully evaluating every target, breaking off attacks when defenses seemed too intense, prioritizing survival over target destruction. Neither approach guaranteed success, and the historical record shows casualties among both aggressive and cautious pilots. The end of the war didn't end the P-47's combat employment. The aircraft served extensively in the Pacific Theater through August 1945 and continued in National Guard and Reserve units for years afterward. Some foreign air forces, including Brazil and Mexico, operated P-47 seconds into the 1950s, but the aircraft's historical significance crystallized during those 11 months of intensive ground attack operations in Europe, when an interceptor designed for 30,000-foot combat redefined itself as a tactical weapon at treetop level. Modern fighter-bomber aircraft inherit the P-47's legacy directly. The F-15E Strike Eagle, a 10 Thunderbolt II, the name itself honors the P-47, and multi-role F-16 seconds all execute missions that originated in Normandy's hedgerows and the Ardennes forests. The integration of air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities in a single platform, now considered standard fighter design, began as an improvisation with scrap metal bomb racks and unauthorized tactics. The transformation happened because operational necessity overrode institutional preferences. The Army Air Forces wanted strategic bombers and escort fighters. They built infrastructure, training programs, and doctrine around those priorities. But the ground war demanded something different: immediate tactical support that could respond within minutes to fluid battlefield conditions. The P-47 proved adaptable to that requirement in ways heavy bombers and dedicated attack aircraft were not. It combined speed, payload capacity, survivability, and availability in proportions that made it ideally suited for intensive tactical employment. That suitability wasn't engineered deliberately. Republic Aviation was solving high-altitude interception problems, not designing close air support platforms. The U.S. Army Air Forces was planning strategic air campaigns, not tactical integration with ground forces. The P-47's effectiveness emerged from characteristics its designers valued for different reasons. The heavy engine that provided high-altitude performance also absorbed ground fire. The massive ammunition capacity meant for sustained dogfights devastated soft targets during strafing. The robust airframe, built to handle high-altitude stresses, survived low-altitude flak damage. This accidental optimization suggests that successful military technology often results from adaptability rather than specialized design. Purpose-built weapons optimized for specific missions can fail when operational requirements change. Flexible platforms that perform adequately across multiple missions prove more valuable than specialists that excel at single tasks. The P-47 wasn't the best air superiority fighter. That was probably the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't the best dedicated attack aircraft, the A-26. Invader carried more ordnance with better accuracy. But the P-47 could do both missions acceptably, and that versatility made it indispensable during the war's crucial final year. The pilots who flew P-47 seconds in combat rarely discussed their missions in heroic terms post-war. Most described ground attack work as procedural, even monotonous. Fly to sector, patrol for targets, attack when found, return to base. The routine nature of the missions, repeated daily for months, stripped away dramatic narratives that characterized air-to-air combat. There were no dramatic dogfights, no single combat against skilled opponents, just repetitive execution of dangerous tasks until the war ended or attrition caught up. This prosaic reality contrasts sharply with popular narratives about fighter aviation. The public imagines fighter pilots as knights of the air, engaged in individual combat testing, skill and courage. Ground attack flying was something closer to industrial labor, dangerous and skilled but ultimately repetitive. Pilots attacked columns, returned to base, rearmed, and attacked more columns. The targets and locations changed, but the fundamental task remained constant. Yet within that repetition lay genuine accomplishment. Each mission contributed incrementally to German defeat. No single strafing run won the war, but thousands of such runs, executed day after day, created conditions where German mobile warfare became impossible. The aggregate effect of mediocre attacks by average pilots, inadequate aircraft produced operational results that no amount of precision bombing or strategic brilliance could match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.